And science shows that our brain actually changes when we're thankful, when we engage gratitude.
The champ is here!
Oh, now I've got to find which microphone he's on because I moved him around the studio. I think he's there.
We moved me because I was moaning about how I look on the camera. Let's be honest.
I'm happy to be honest.
I was slamming the lighting, the cameras.
He's like, I'm getting all drowned out and my bald head is shining. It's not. Anyway, we've moved him to a better seat. He's like that person in economy class who's like, can I get an upgrade to premium?
And we won't talk about vanity.
You call yourself a man of faith. Far out. I was getting scared here, being threatened by... Good morning, Frank.
Good morning.
How's it to have the crew back?
It's nice.
It is
Welcome
nice,
back.
eh?
Welcome back from the mountain, Bjorn.
Thank you. Yeah, it does feel... I felt a little bit of a stranger this week when I turned up to work and stuff. I was like, man, I haven't done this in a long time.
I bet. It's been, how long has it been? 3-4 months?
Yeah, getting close to that, so it feels like it.
We're going to dive into Proverbs. It's a verse that a lot of people are familiar with, trusting in the Lord with all your heart, leaning not on your understanding.
Yeah.
Advice to people who are struggling to trust the Lord when it just becomes a little bit overwhelming.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I'm going to speak here as someone who does not do this well. So I'm going to point to people who I admire in this realm and point to their wisdom and what I've seen in their life that hits this. But I want to add another verse to this because I think there's some stuff in this verse that helps us with that verse. So I'm going to turn to Philippians 4, starting at verse 4. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I'll say rejoice. And there'll be a bunch of people for whom a song just kicked off in their head. The ESV says reasonableness, but many other translations say gentleness. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your request be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. It's really good, but it actually gives some instructions there. Prayer and supplication with thanksgiving.
What's a supplication?
It's a request. It's asking for something. I think about my life, and I don't deal with stress and worry and anxiety very well at all. I spend many nights, if there's something stressful going on in my life, I don't sleep. I think about it all night, and I worry. So I haven't mastered this yet. But there's someone in my life who passed away recently. My father-in-law passed away a couple of weekends ago. And my father-in-law and I, when we first met, deep respect, really liked each other, but we would argue about so much stuff. There were some big things that we had disagreements about. But the more I watched him, the more I noticed someone who just seemed to be at peace with the world and was thankful about everything. Wasn't chasing after a whole lot of stuff. Had his priorities right. Just seemed to cruise through the world at times where I would have been very stressed in the exact same situation. But as I heard about what he was like as my wife was growing up and his daughters were growing up, his irritability was mentioned, and I can totally relate. He was easily irritated at times. When I'm really stressed, I am easily irritated. So clearly the man I was seeing was not the man he always was. And there was one night he was staying with us, and I remember coming down in the stupid hours of the morning to make coffee and to sit in the quiet, and he was staying with us. We were living in a little 2-story townhouse, bedrooms upstairs, lounge downstairs. He was probably sleeping downstairs. I remember coming down the stairs, and I saw him kneeling in a corner of the room with his face to the ground, praying. And that changed everything about how I saw him, because I knew he'd been doing that for years and years and years and years. So he was acting out Philippians 4, prayer and supplication. When I listened to how he would talk from then on, I heard a lot of thankfulness. So he was engaging that thankfulness there. What I really liked about seeing someone at that stage of his life, and knowing that there was a stage of his life where he was probably a lot more like I am now, that practice over time had shaped him and had transformed him into someone for whom the anxieties, the worries, the cares of the world were not weighing heavy. He'd been shaped by those things, and the Holy Spirit had shaped him in those practices to be someone who was at peace, for whom the worries weren't weighing heavy. So if you read verses like this in Proverbs, and you find yourself worrying and you think, I'm not hitting the mark. I am stressed and I am anxious and I am worried. It's okay. You don't have to be some big warrior who's got it all together. Just think about those practices: prayer, supplication, coming to God, putting it before God, regularly, being thankful, engaging the process of thankfulness. And science shows that our brain actually changes when we're thankful. When we engage gratitude. So that verse there is leaning into something that science now backs up to say that if you engage this regularly, your brain will shift and it will change and you will not be as anxious. But it's a long, slow process of engaging in faithful practice to get there. It's not a magic overnight thing.
Unfortunately.
Everyone's like,
man.
I keep buying books and trying practices, looking for the thing that's going to instantly work, and none of it does.
So you say you don't do this well. I don't do this well either. So your default is to go back to another verse that you wrote, that you read out. There, right? In all things, pray about everything.
Yeah.
Right?
And to look, see, this is why the elderly in our life are so important. Because if I look at people who are in the exact same situation that I am, I'll find the occasional few who are just somehow magically not easily irritated when they're stressed, and there's something, I don't know, in their disposition that makes them some sort of spiritual superhuman. But it's more likely that if I look towards the elderly and I look at their practices, rather than just trying to find the books and the magic people who have the platforms, if I just look at the older people in my life, more often than not, I'm probably going to find people, especially if they've been of faith for a long time, whether I theologically agree with them or not, I'm probably going to find people who are more settled, love God, they've stuck at it, they've done the faithful hard yards year after year after year, and it's them that I can learn from. And looking at them and then hearing about what they were like when they were younger, I'll probably find that they were a little more like me. And so if I track in the same direction that they've tracked in, maybe when I'm in my 70s and 80s, maybe I'll be that guy too.
Why wait that long, though? Well, that's a long way away for a lot of people.
It's the reality, though, right? It's like when you buy a fruit tree and plant it, it takes a few years before you actually get any fruit out of it, right? It doesn't just pop out.
I think we get sold this idea that God does things instantaneously. And in some instances, he does. But more often than not, he wants us to track with him in relationship over a long period of time. I'm a better husband to my wife, hopefully now, than I was when we first got married. That's taken over 20 years to get to that point. So what does another 20 years of relationship mean? It's the same with God.
Coming up next, we're going to talk a little bit about should Christians engage with other faiths, and what about going into their buildings? We're going to talk to Frank about that coming up next. Special guest Frank Ritchie, the Rev, joining us in studio this morning.
The champ is here!
Yeah, you stand uniquely above all contributors on this show, Frank, because you actually have 2 sets of intro music.
I feel deeply honoured. I don't know what I think about this piece of music, but I feel deeply honoured.
Well, you also, in addition to that, you get to choose where you want to sit in studio, and you get to make recommendations about our digital team as well.
That's what happens when you just kick up a diva stink about something. I was acting like a bit of a diva.
Moving on to our second topic, Frank, and this one actually came up from me, and it was a little experience I had while I was overseas, and I thought it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on it. So I was recently just in Nepal, for anyone that's listening, and while we were there, I went to we went past a Buddhist monastery that was in a town called Tengboche, and it's really, really big, and for the whole area, it's kind of like the centerpiece, right? And some of our guides were like, "Oh, do you want to go in? We can show you around," and the monks are in there and stuff. And I was like, "Oh yeah, I'd love to see inside this building. I don't really know anything about Buddhism or whatever." So I went in there along with some other people, but there were some people in our group that very much didn't feel comfortable with that and chose not to, and they stayed outside, and that's cool. And it just kind of got me thinking about, is there anything in the Bible, or what are your thoughts around Christians engaging with other faiths, and especially other places of worship? And is there any kind of boundaries or limits of where Christians should sort of say that's not for me, or I won't go there or partake in that, or where does that start or end?
Yeah, Paul deals with it a little in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 when he's talking about food that's been offered to idols. And he essentially makes the case that idols don't have any existence. And so if your conscience allows you to eat food that's been offered to idols, feel free. But he says there are those, though, for whom their conscience isn't there. And particularly people who, in the context of the church in Corinth, particularly people who might have once partaken of and worshipped those idols, and now they've come to Christian faith, and to therefore eat the food offered to those idols has this really strong association with something that is not honoring to God. So he would say for those people, don't do it. And he would say for those whose conscience is free, don't act in such a way that would cause those people to engage in something that would cause them to violate their conscience. So there's that. Then there's Paul in Acts 17. And in Acts 17, Paul is going to speak at the Areopagus. This is in Athens. He's been speaking to the philosophers and he's been speaking in the marketplace. And so they effectively want to put him on trial in front of the city's leaders, their thinkers, their philosophers. Before he goes there, he wanders around the city and he sees all their practices. Now, I suspect, based on what he then said, he's probably walked into some places of worship and seen their idols. He's seen their statues. He's seen what they do. He understands their religious practices. So then when he goes and sees them, he knows exactly who he's engaging with. So he's learned by wandering around the city of Athens and looking at how they worship and what they do. So then he can speak to them and he can relate God to their circumstances. I've had to engage this question when I've travelled as well. Do I walk into other spaces? Or when I was here in New Zealand and I wanted to know more about the Islamic faith and Ramadan, I engaged in the fasting of Ramadan and I broke fast a few times with some Islamic friends and I went into the mosque. But I set some boundaries for myself that my conscience was okay with. So I've always said if I go into other spaces, when I've travelled into other countries and I've wanted to walk into the spaces of other religions, the worship spaces, or I've gone into mosques here in New Zealand or other spaces, I will never bow down. So I'll never do anything that feels like an act of worship.
Yeah.
I reserve that for the God that I worship and the spaces that I worship in. But I also want to be able to invite people of other faiths into my church spaces and into some of the practices that I do. And so there's this sense of mutual respect that if I want them to do that, then I need to be willing to do that with them as well. And if I want to be able to speak to them about God and relate my faith into their life, then I need to understand who they are and how they think and what they do. But again, conscience drives this. So if you feel like you're going to walk into a space, don't just go, hey, Reverend Frank said on the radio, it's okay. But my conscience says that it's not.
I feel
Follow that
extremely
conscience.
uncomfortable, but I've been told it's fine.
Well, you
Yeah.
use the word respect there, right? If you're respectful of the space, you can still hold on to what's true to you.
Yeah.
But just be respectful of the space.
And be okay with disagreeing. Like going into a mosque when I was exploring understanding Ramadan and not bowing down was not offensive to anybody that I interacted with because they would be exactly the same. And they expressed that they would be exactly the same if they came into a Christian worship space. So
They're
it's
probably
no-
not going to take communion. You
Yeah.
imagine. Yeah.
So it's the people who struggle with understanding this are people who don't have any religious, spiritual belief. If you talk to most people who have some sort of understanding of religion or they have a deeply held spiritual belief about how the world works, then when we hear each other talk like this, it makes perfect sense. So all of my Muslim friends would completely understand why I would not bow down walking into a mosque because they'd be exactly the same coming into a Christian worship space. So this is not a difficult thing to grapple with.
Mainly it's about staying true to yourself and following the nudgings inside your heart.
Yeah.
Wherever that is for you. 7:30, we've got to get to the news. Nice to have you in this week, Frank, and we'll see you again next week.
A pleasure. Thank you.